Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we journey into the ancient city of Rome, untold corners, forgotten alleys, and the silent lives of those history often overlooks. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already snug under your blanket, thank you for letting me keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. I'm curious to know who's on the other side of the screen tonight. Now let's slip quietly into the rhythms of Rome, where every dawn in the doys brings another cycle of service, caution, and tiny flickers of hope. Before the sun mounts high over the Capitoline Hill, Rome stirs. Roosters crow in the alleyways, jars clatter on wooden carts, and the patter of metal sandals echoes as city criers ring out the day's announcements. In the cellars of a doas, tucked between two insulae, a slave begins the first ritual of survival. This ritual is familiar, unremarkable. Yet upon close inspection, it reveals the depth of that small hidden world. The domes is quiet. Only the flicker of torchlight betrays activity in the atrium's undercraft oft. Once the coals crackle bright, attention turns to water. From terracotta systems in the back, slaves draw bucket after bucket, tepid iron-tasting water that will steam in bronze basins. This labor is the prelude to something that feels for a moment like dignity. Scholars describe houses of privilege equipped with private baths where servants might slide towels over their patrons' shoulders after a soak. The ritual flows onward. Sandals, tunics, togas. A single misstep, a crease in the toga, a misaligned fold can earn a lash. Slaves learn precision before pride. They are charged with setting the table. Bowls of olives, flatbread, and watered wine. They stand just outside the threshold of family breakfast, present yet invisible, always holding the sky of their masters' lives in silent attendance. By mid-morning, the atrium doors open wide, and outside lies the city's chaos. Peddlers hawk eggs and cheese on the pavement below. The stink of sewage mingles with the heat of cooking fires. Scholars tell us that many of Rome's slums lacked any sanitation, and the smell swayed every villa and mansion alike. A slave glances over the sill, watching children dart between vendors, and sees that this world is both expansive and brutal. Marketplaces are where gossip spreads, rumors brew, rumors that might seal fortunes or sentence bodies. The afternoon must pass without incident. Tasks follow tasks, sweeping the impluvium pool, scrubbing oil lamps, knitting sandals, folding scrolls. There are whispers, orders for a scroll to be delivered to a senator's house, murmurs of imperial spies, talk of unrest in a distant province. A single overheard remark, the master of tomorrow might rewind a slave's fate. With every step in shuffling servitude, each moment carries the charge of possibility, freedom, sale, or punishment. When dusk drapes the atrium in long shadows, the bath chamber comes alive again. Slaves wait in the epitium, ready to guard toggers, bronze mirrors, woolen caps. Each owned item proof of status and spent pride. They wrap towels, hold combs, and smooth wet hair. The patina of daily life glistens in every gesture. In the silence between prayers, between polished vessels, there exists a certain grace. Then comes dinner, the scener, more bread, salted fish, watered wine, the clink of dishes, sighs of relief from the masters. In the hazy glow of oil lamps, servants, still without name, move like ghosts through peripheral light, clearing plates, doling out wine, extinguishing braziers that have burned too low. That night, the slave returns to the cool basement, the straw pallet, the thin blanket. From the aperture above, an impluvium or slit in the stone, the heavens appear. A star hangs over the city. No singular destiny bears upon it. Tomorrow will be the same day in another costume of tasks and hushed breaths. The difference may come or may not when the sun next steals back the night. In Rome, the do was more than a home. It was a machine, a finely tuned apparatus of class, control, and quiet choreography, operated silently by slaves. To the outside world, the master was the face of the household, the name etched in marble, the man with clients and power. But beneath every polished column and painted wall was an unseen network of human labor, so normalized it was barely acknowledged. Slaves swept the floors, polished the gods, filled the lamps, and remembered 1,000 unsaid rules. They were the software behind the city's greatest displays of wealth. To fail at any part of this hidden code could be fatal. Not always immediately, not always publicly, but always eventually. A poorly tied to, a missed errand, a gesture made at the wrong time. The margin for error was not narrow, it was imaginary. Unlike the slaves of countryside estates or imperial mines who knew backbreaking work from sunrise to exhaustion, the urban house slave dealt in subtler forms of pressure. He lived among marble and mosaic, but none of it belonged to him. He passed caged songbirds whose food bowls he scrubbed. He refilled wine for philosophers whose names would endure for centuries. He held the reins of children who would one day inherit the very house he slept beneath. In many cases, he was born into slavery. A bearer raised alongside the children of the house, educated not for his own sake, but for convenience. A house-born slave could be fluent in Latin and Greek, might know how to prepare herbs for medicine, how to correct a child's grammar, or how to soothe the client's anger before it reached the master's ears. The more skilled he was, the more valuable he became, but also paradoxically, the more expendable. The more the slave existed in the background of every decision, every mood shift in the master's household. If the Petilius returned home angry from the forum, it was the slave who adjusted his schedule. If the matron found fault in the arrangement of her hairpins, it was the slave who suffered the correction. In a home where the master's word was law and the law did not recognize the slave as human, survival became an art. You learn not just how to obey, but how to anticipate, how to vanish at the right moment, how to be useful but never intrusive, how to exist without edges. Silence was the currency of endurance. It was not uncommon for a slave to be trusted with secrets, the mistress's coded letters, the master's debts, the son's affairs. But trust was a dangerous gift. A trusted slave became a confidant, a witness, a liability. Many were forced to act as accomplices in schemes that could see them executed if revealed. The Roman legal system, ever pragmatic, allowed for torture of slaves during trials. Testimony was not admissible unless extracted under pain. This meant that a slave could know the truth of a crime, could recite every word of a conversation, but until his body was broken, his words carried no weight. And if his body broke too soon, the truth would die with him. This institutional cruelty wasn't an oversight. It was part of the system's brilliance. It kept everyone afraid. Even among slaves, there was a hierarchy. The dispensator, often a male slave, oversaw finances and could exercise authority over others. The oarius, a doorkeeper, held the keys, both literal and symbolic, to the rhythms of the house. Kitchen slaves, bath attendants, tutors, scribes, and nursemaids all occupied different rungs of the invisible ladder. Rivalries simmered, alliances formed and dissolved. A word whispered in favor or against could shift someone from the atrium to the stables, from the stables to the mines, from the mines to the grave. And yet through all this, slaves maintained relationships, fell in love, bore children. Roman law dictated that any child born to an enslaved woman was also a slave, no matter the father. Entire generations lived and died inside single households, their lineage traceable only through old account scrolls and broken grave tablets. Occasionally, manumission flickered like a star over the heads of the most favored. Freedom, in theory, could be earned. A master might free a slave in gratitude in his will or in recognition of years of service. The freed person would become a libertus, bound still to their former master in a web of obligation, but legally autonomous. Some even amassed modest wealth. But for most, this was a myth kept alive to soothe the soul. Hope, after all, was cheaper than justice. Some slaves were granted a peculi, a small sum they could manage, technically still owned by the master, but used as though it were their own. With this, a slave might purchase his freedom. In practice, it was rare. A rumor, a change of mood, or a single insult could see the peculi revoked without explanation. Dreams dissolved in ink and papyrus. And so the day passed, not with drama, but with discipline. After the last client had been shown to the door, after the children had been bathed and the mistress had taken her wine, the slave would scrub away the day's grease and ash. He would carry out chamber pots, restock oil lamps, fold linens, and check shutters. There would be no thanks. There would be no dismissal. Only sleep if he was allowed it. Sleep in a corner of a cold cell on straw that scratched the skin raw among others who might steal a blanket in the night out of desperation. In the darkness, there were whispers about manumission, about escape, about quiet deaths that no one asked questions about, and then silence until the fire needed stoking again. What we know of these lives comes not from their own words. There are few surviving letters or records written by slaves, but from the margins of the text that celebrated their masters. We see them in graffiti on villa walls, in cursed name tablets, in burial stones ordered by those lucky few who escaped servitude. We see their names sometimes etched in clumsy Latin: Felix, Tiro, Secundus, names often given by owners, names that meant things like lucky or second. Irony was never in short supply in Rome. In every era, there are those who live inside the machinery of power, anonymous and unpaid, holding up the edifice so others may dance above them. In ancient Rome, that role belonged to the slave, not as a metaphor, not as an idea, but as a person breathing, calculating, enduring, erasing themselves hour by hour so the empire could shine. In a city where marble temples brushed the sky and gutters overflowed with human waste, power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore a tunic, a simple homespun tunic tied at the waist, unmarked, unadorned, and belonging to a man who technically wasn't a man at all. He was a slave, but not just any slave. He was a dispensator, the financial steward of a wealthy Roman household. And in the peculiar logic of Rome, this meant that a man with no rights, who could be beaten on a whim, who legally counted as property somewhere between livestock and furniture, could also hold the keys to another man's fortune. It began, as these things often did, with trust and necessity. The master was a senator, self-important, ambitious, and too dignified to deal directly with butchers, wool merchants, or his own wife's spending habits. Delegation was essential, so he assigned the task to one of his houseborn slaves. Intelligent, quiet, literate in Greek and Latin. The slave kept ledgers, balanced accounts, arranged payments, negotiated contracts. Over time, the master's wealth grew under his stewardship. So too did the slave's influence, though no one would have admitted it aloud. Roman senators might strut through the forum in white to more than one owed their comfort to a man they could legally have crucified. This dispensator was allowed at peculium, a personal fund he controlled. Technically still owned by his master, but managed independently. Many masters allowed this, thinking it encouraged better performance. After all, slaves with something to lose worked harder. But what few expected was that some slaves, especially the clever ones, could make their peculi grow faster than their master's estate. This man did slowly, quietly. He began lending money, first to other slaves, then to freedmen, eventually to minor patricians, always with interest, always with records. The transactions were small, invisible to the world that only saw senators and Caesars, but the numbers added up. He was eventually manumitted, freed in a formal ceremony, and granted the name of his former master as a mark of patronage. That too was the Roman way. Freedom came with a price. Lifelong loyalty to the one who once owned you. Freed men became clients expected to vote, praise, and sometimes bribe their former masters. Still, it was freedom of a sort, and as a freed man, this former slave did something astonishing. He opened a taberna argentaria, a banking stall near the forum. From there, he began trading not just coin, but favors, information, and influence. Rumors suggest he once financed a senatorial campaign, anonymously, of course. Rome had no appetite for being publicly outmaneuvered by its former property. But he never lived in a villa, never wore the senator's ring. He kept his quarters modest, his hair close-cropped, his habits quiet. Perhaps he understood that Rome was tolerant of the exceptional slave, but never of the boastful freedman. It was one thing to rise, another to be seen rising, and so he moved in the shadows of power. A man who once couldn't speak in court without torture, now holding debts over men who wrote laws. His story doesn't end in tragedy, but it doesn't end in triumph either. He died, as many Romans did, of fever probably, or food gone bad in the wrong season. His grave marker, if it existed, has long been worn smooth by time, But somewhere in the crumbling archives of a forgotten banker's scroll is a name scratched in practice Latin. A man who began life as property and ended it as creditor. Rome was full of contradictions, but none more absurd, more revealing than this: that a slave could run an empire's household finances while being worth less on paper than a donkey. In the ashes of Pompeii, they found many things: the outlines of bodies caught mid-breath, l'uovo of bread still sitting in ovens, the shadow of a dog curled in eternal panic near a locked door. But among the most curious discoveries was something far smaller, buried nearby, the back of a modest villa's kitchen, a lead tablet folded tightly like a secret clenched in a fist, inscribed in careful, spiteful Latin. It was a curse. Lead curse tablets, defixiones, were not unusual in the Roman world. They were common, in fact, tucked beneath doorways, buried in graves, nailed to temples, or dropped into sacred springs. Most were created by the poor, the powerless, the unseen, people who had no other tools but anger and superstition. And while many curses were written by jealous lovers or gamblers chasing their losses, this one seemed different. The handwriting was rough. The language was personal, and the target wasn't a rival in love or sport. It was another slave. The tablet read approximately, "May your hands shake and your tongue rot. May your bread burn and your oil spoil. May you fall from the master's favor and be sold to the mines far from the light." It was unsigned, of course, but the archaeologists who found it believed it was left by one kitchen slave against another. Perhaps a rival in rank or a newcomer who had been favored too quickly. We often imagine slavery as a solid block of shared misery. But even in bondage, there were hierarchies, jealousies, betrayals. The kitchen, like the court, was a battlefield. Only the weapons were quieter: a stolen onion here, a scorched pan blamed on someone else, a whispered comment to the steward about someone's laziness. When formal punishment could come at the flick of a master's ring, the politics of a Roman kitchen could be just as ruthless as anything in the Senate. But a curse, a defixio that was different, that was personal. It was an act of desperation disguised as ritual. There was no guarantee the gods would hear it. But maybe, just maybe, some minor underworld deity would listen and twist fate ever so slightly. Spoil the rival's stew, loosen the handles of their afore, make their hands shake at the wrong moment. That's all it would take. A burnt dish, a dropped goblet. One mistake and the master's wrath would do the rest. What's even more telling is the placement of the tablet. It wasn't buried in a temple or tossed in a river. It was hidden in the very soil beneath the kitchen itself, planted like a seed, as if the author wanted the curse to grow up through the walls and into the hands of their enemy. That detail, more than any line of the curse, tells us who this person was. Not just a victim of slavery, but a participant in its cruel ecology, someone who understood how to work within the system's rot. There's no record of what happened to the cursed slave. No trial, no sale, no vindication. But the curse remained pressed in lead long after the volcano swallowed both victim and accuser. A petty grudge fossilized in volcanic ash. A whisper of pain passed down through 2,000 years. We don't know their names, but we know their anger. And we know they believed, even in a world where they had no rights, no freedom, no future, that they could still reach across the void and strike at their enemy with words. And maybe for one of them, that was enough. Roman justice was many things: efficient, brutal, theatrical. But above all, it was deeply unequal. If you were a citizen, the law bent to recognize your name, your standing, your birth. If you were a slave, the law didn't recognize you at all. You were not a person. You were evidence. You were property. And property didn't testify unless it screamed first. By Roman law, a slave's testimony was inadmissible unless obtained under torture. The logic, cold and unyielding, was that a slave might lie to protect a master, but pain, they believed, made lies melt. So if the courts needed your truth, they'd beat it out of you. Truth through agony, justice through suffering. Rome at its most Roman. One case preserved in the legal writings of later jurists concerned a master suspected of poisoning his own brother. Suspicion had fallen on him quietly. Too many debts, too sudden a death, too well-timed an inheritance. The courts needed testimony. And so they turned to the people closest to the crime, the household slaves, the very ones who had poured the wine, prepared the meals, stood silently in the room where the dying man gasped and clutched his stomach. The most senior of them, a household steward, was selected first. He had worked for the family for over a decade. Loyal, literate, trusted. It didn't matter. He was stripped and bound, and the tools of Roman interrogation were brought forward. Ropes, pulleys, fire, whips. We do not have the full transcript. We rarely do. But somewhere amid the blood and the broken sentences, the story emerged. The master had laced the wine with something foul, something untraceable. The steward had not known it at the time, not fully, but later when the pieces fell into place, he had kept quiet. What else was he supposed to do? Report his owner? Speak up and die? He was a slave. Even his thoughts weren't his own. But now, under the weight of the state-sanctioned torment, the truth came out. The court believed him, or believed enough of him. And the master was tried, found guilty, sentenced not to death. He was too well coned, but to exile. His property was seized, his household dismantled. And what became of the slave? He was not freed, he was not rewarded, he was sold. That was the final twist. His testimony, true and courageous and wrenched from the bone, had ruined the family's name. No other member wanted to keep him in the house. Too many memories, too many eyes had seen him speaking to the magistrate. He was dangerous now, not because he lied, but because he could speak at all. He was sent to a villa in the countryside, according to the records, to serve under another master, one with fewer ambitions and hopefully fewer secrets. This was Rome, a city where a man could commit murder and buy his way out, where a slave could tell the truth and be punished for it, where courage was a disposable commodity and silence was often safer than justice. Yet in the strange way that history sometimes works, it is the slave whose words survived, not the master. His name faded from court rolls and family scrolls. The steward's testimony, though born in screams, became law, cited by jurists for centuries as precedent, a case study in how even the lowliest voice could bring down a house if only the state was willing to listen. It's a hollow kind of justice. But in Rome, that was the only kind most people ever got. Roman law didn't recognize the marriage of slaves. There was no ceremony, no binding contract, no public record. No priest stood to bless the union. No legal clause protected it. And yet slaves fell in love. They formed bonds, raised children, shed scraps of sleep and hope in the margins of a world that refused to name them. Historians call these unions conternium, a word that sounds more like a legal formality than what it truly was. Defiance disguised as domesticity. Some slave couples were granted the luxury of staying together. It depended on the mood of the master, the productivity of the household, the convenience of keeping affection contained. One such couple is known to us only by their epitaphs. Modest stones found near Rome, weathered but intact. Their names are lost in translation, but their story isn't. They lived in the same domus, perhaps born there or brought in from nearby provinces. One was a seamstress, skilled in linen work. The other worked in the baths, stoking fires, hauling water, tending to his master's grooming needs. They shared a corner of a servant's room, a cracked bowl, a hidden carved trinket, maybe a lock of hair. We know they had a child born into slavery like them, and we know they called each other konaks in the inscriptions, a word that usually meant spouse. They used it anyway. They took what words they could. They were, by all accounts, devoted, which made what happened next all the more familiar and all the more Roman. One day the master's finances took a turn. He owed favors to a man in Sicily, a merchant, or a magistrate perhaps. And so, in the casual cruelty of Alger's logic, he cleared part of the debt by sending away one of the slaves. Not both, just one. The seamstress was sold. She was packed up, inventoried like a household object, and shipped to another household a week's journey away. Her partner was not informed until the morning of her departure. The child was kept in Rome. It was more efficient that way. There was no appeal, no protest. Slaves had no legal means to object. And even an outburst could lead to punishment. Not just flogging, but being sent to the mines or branded with the letters FUG for fugitivus. So the man did what many slaves did in the face of irreversible loss. He did nothing. He went to work. He poured the wine. He folded the clothes. He survived. But he also carved a message, deep, awkward letters pressed into a beam behind the bathhouse. It was uncovered centuries later, barely legible beneath layers of soot and lime. It read, "Under the gods, I wait. No name, no date, just those 5 words. Was it meant for her? Was it meant for the god? Was it meant to survive? No one knows. What we do know is that these stories were not rare. Roman slave markets divided families with bureaucratic indifference. Children were sold without parents. Partners were separated across provinces. The only thing that made this couple unusual is that someone recorded them. Someone buried them with enough care that their memory didn't vanish completely. There is something almost cruel about how much emotion survives in such dry records. A fragment of pottery scratched with a farewell. A tombstone that says to my most faithful graffiti that simply reads, "I miss your voice." Rome had laws, coins, battles, emperors, but it also had this. A city full of people loving quietly where no one was watching and losing everything because no one cared. In a society built on control, there was one freedom even the Roman state could not fully take: the freedom to stop eating. The Roman world knew many forms of rebellion: mutinies and legions, peasant uprisings, full-blown slave revolts, like the Spartacus rebellion that shook the Republic to its core. But those were the exceptions, the violent headlines in a history otherwise written in silence. Most rebellion didn't come with swords. It came with withdrawal. One slave, unnamed, as most were, was punished for a minor offense. The records don't say what. Maybe he dropped something. Maybe he looked at the wrong person the wrong way. It doesn't matter. He was beaten, locked in a storeroom, and left to think about obedience. The master believed the usual rules would apply. Pain would remind the body who owned it. Hunger would bring about compliance. A few days without food, and the lesson would settle in like a bruise. But the slave didn't eat. Not the next day, not the day after that, not even when food was offered. Coarse bread, a handful of lentils, the usual slave rations. He refused, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. Day after day, at first the master was amused, then irritated, then confused. Why refuse food when you could take it and live? Why choose to die in such a slow, inefficient way? By the 5th day, the other slaves had noticed. Some whispered prayers for him, others warned him. A few perhaps envied the strength he must have had, not in body, but in mind. Because Roman slavery was not just a condition of labor. It was a mental architecture. You were supposed to believe that you were what they said you were. It's like property, tools, animated instruments. To reject food, to choose nothing over survival, was to challenge that framework at its core. Eventually, the master panicked, not out of compassion, but pragmatism. Slaves were expensive, and dead ones couldn't be sold. He ordered the man force-fed. It failed. The slave clamped his jaws shut, bit his own tongue, wretched up what little they managed to pour in. He was already too weak to be dragged back into full submission. The story ends, as you'd expect, in death. Not a dramatic martyrdom, just silence. One less name in the roster, one more body buried without ceremony. But the story lived on, not in poems, not in monuments, but in legal commentary. Roman jurists discussed this kind of defiance in passing, mostly to wonder how best to prevent it. But one line written almost as a footnote stands out. Some refuse food not from madness, but from sorrow or stubbornness. A dangerous stubbornness, the kind that spreads. They were afraid of it. That was the real legacy of this man. Not his body, buried or burned with no marker, but the ripple his refusal sent through the logic of power. Because if one slave could choose death over obedience, others might too. And you can't crucify someone who's already gone. You can't sell someone who doesn't want the price. In a world that measured worth by productivity, choosing to disappear was a final, irreversible refusal to play the game. If you want to understand Rome, you must begin with what it erased. Not its cities, which left their bones in marble. Not its emperors who carved their names into time. No, you begin with the silence. The massive, deliberate quiet that swallowed millions of voices before they were ever written down. And nowhere was that silence more complete than in the minds of the enslaved. There are no memoirs of Roman slavery, no surviving journals, no first-person accounts, no confessionals buried in wax tablets. What we have are shadows cast by other men's torches. glimpses of the enslaved as described by philosophers, playwrights, and jurists. We know how they were punished. We know how much they cost. We know which jobs they held and what legal category they fell into. But what they thought, what they feared, hoped, remembered was mostly lost. Not because they had no thoughts, but because no one bothered to ask. And if someone did, they didn't write it down. And yet in this vacuum, there is still something to learn, because silence isn't empty, it's structured. Rome didn't just ignore its slaves, it built systems to contain them, reshape them, redefine them. Slavery in Rome wasn't just physical labor or legal status, it was psychological engineering. The goal was not simply obedience, but internalization. A Roman slave wasn't supposed to obey out of fear. He was supposed to obey because he believed there was no alternative. That belief was cultivated from birth. Many slaves were born into servitude. Very houseborn, raised under the same roof as the children of their owners. From infancy, they learned that the master's voice was law, that rewards were conditional, and that even affection could be revoked like a tax privilege. They were praised for loyalty, for silence, for anticipating needs before they were spoken. And when they were older, they were sold off without explanation. Loyalty was a one-way mirror. The Romans didn't think of this as cruelty. They thought of it as efficient. Discipline wasn't about rage, it was about order. If a slave disobeyed, he might be whipped, branded, shackled, or crucified. But the real tool of control wasn't punishment, it was normalization. It was the idea that pain was part of the architecture, that to be seen was dangerous, that to hope was treacherous, that the best thing you could do, the safest thing, was to disappear inside your own skin. This created an inner life that is hard to imagine today. A mind trained to split itself, one part calculating every movement to avoid punishment, the other bearing any thought of freedom too deep to reach. And yet cracks still formed. They always do. The graffiti walls of Pompeii, Aestia, and Herculaneum are scattered with strange little messages. Some obscene, some poetic, some pleading. A few are almost heartbreakingly simple. One scratched onto the wall of a latrine reads, "I was here, I am still here." It's easy to forget that even in the deepest systems of control, people are still people. They whisper jokes. They fall in love. They fantasize. They rebel, not always with swords, but with sighs, with stolen moments, with stubborn stares. A slave who teaches himself to read in secret is rebelling. A slave who hums a forbidden tune while scrubbing the floor is resisting. A slave who carves a name into the stone beneath his bedding, even just a first name, a made-up name, is saying, "I exist." And sometimes Rome had to respond to these cracks. There were laws passed not just to control slave labor, but to limit what they could wear, how they could gather, and even what kind of dreams they might pursue. One law forbade slaves from dressing too finely in public in case they were mistaken for free men. Another warned masters not to educate their slaves too well, lest they become too clever, too bold. It was as if the entire empire knew that beneath the appearance of duality, something else was always humming, low and steady, like a fault line. That was the paradox of Rome's greatness. It needed the slave, but it feared his mind. It needed his labor, but dreaded his voice. So it built a civilization that ran on silence, but a silence constantly at risk of cracking open into noise. And sometimes it did. Officially, freedom in Rome was a ceremony, a formal act, a dignified gift bestowed by the master in gratitude, in generosity, in death. The slave knelt before a magistrate or was touched with a symbolic rod. His name was read aloud. A cap of liberty might be placed on his head, a token purse given to mark his new status. He rose not as a slave, but as a libertus, a freedman, beholden to his former master as patron, but legally autonomous. This was manumission, neat, public, controlled. And like most things in Rome, it was also a lie. Because for every slave who earned his freedom through decades of loyalty, or who was freed in a will, or who bought it with a sanctioned piculi, there were others who found different ways, unofficial ways that weren't celebrated in the forum, but whispered about in the alleyways behind bathhouse and taverns. This was the black market of freedom, a fragile ecosystem of bribes, forgeries, secret savings, and dangerous favors where a slave might not escape in body, but could begin to unshackle his future one coin at a time. The most common route was economic. Some masters allowed trusted slaves to earn or handle small sums. The peculi technically it belonged to the master, but in practice it gave the slave a strange sort of leverage. With luck, cleverness, and time, it could grow. A slave might lend it out, invest it through a friend, even open a stall using a free agent's name. None of it was legal, of course, but it was tolerated so long as the profits flowed upward. But in hidden corners, some slaves hoarded coins quietly, burying them behind systems, under loose tiles, or inside hollowed table legs. It was a slow, invisible rebellion, a financial ghost wearing a chain. There were those who used that coin to buy freedom, not through official channels, but through bribery. A board steward, a desperate magistrate's clear, a house scribe in debt. All it took was the right sum, the right silence. A document could be forged, a status updated, a name misplaced in the census. One day you were a slave, the next no one could prove it. Of course, the risk was enormous. Discovery meant flogging, mutilation, sale to the mines. But to those who had nothing, the risk meant possibility. And sometimes possibility was worth everything. And then there were the more elaborate schemes. Slaves who vanished only to reappear in distant cities with new names and invented pasts. Slaves who arranged their own sales to sympathetic freedmen, essentially buying themselves via a proxy. Slaves who claimed to be war captives never properly processed or found loopholes in chaotic moments, like civil wars, plagues, or changes in administration. Rome was vast. Records were flawed. In the right moment, a lie became law. We even have records, mostly fragmentary, of freed men who helped enslaved relatives fake manumission. A brother might be legally freed, then claim his sister was freed in the same will, conveniently misfiled. Some cases succeeded, others resulted in re-enslavement, and always the fear of exposure lingered. A change in political climate, a jealous rival, a suspicious neighbor, all could unravel the illusion. But perhaps the strangest part of the black market of freedom was how often it existed with the master's knowledge. There were owners who knew their slaves were hoarding money or hiding away favors or forging futures, and they allowed it, not out of kindness, but pragmatism. A slave who believed freedom was within reach was often more obedient than one who saw no way out. Hope, even false hope, was the cheapest method of control. Why beat a man when you can bribe him with a dream? Still, Rome was not a place that admired cleverness in the powerless. When these things were discovered, the backlash was brutal. The law had no patience for unauthorized liberation. A slave who forged manumission could be executed. A freedman who helped could be stripped of rights or sent back into servitude. The message was clear. Freedom is not your right, it is our gift. And yet the black market persisted because freedom, even the idea of it, is contagious. It spreads in whispers. It hides in closets. It folds itself into fake documents and forged names. It passes between hands like a secret prayer. No monument in Rome tells the story of this hidden economy, but it was there beneath the statues and beneath the law. An undercurrent of quiet resistance as old as the city itself. When people think of Roman slavery, they often picture the arena, the roar of the crowd, the glint of a gladius, the moment a man kneels before Caesar and waits for a thumb to determine his fate. It's theatrical, iconic, a story Rome told so often even its enemies remembered it. But the truth, the full truth, is not about glory. It's about waste. Industrialized, ritualized waste. The arena was not a stage for heroes. It was a slaughterhouse for the disposable. Most gladiators were slaves, not all. Some were volunteers called a lorati, men so desperate for coin or fame that they signed away their freedom. But the majority were bought, captured, or condemned. They came from every corner of the empire. Prisoners of war from Gaul, petty criminals from the streets of Rome, rebellious slaves punished with iron instead of fire. The label damnati ludum, condemned to the games, was less a sentence than the slow-motion execution. Rome had many kinds of arenas and many kinds of games. The most famous were the Mona, blood spectacles hosted by politicians meant to honor the dead and impress the living. But there were others. Venyans, animal hunts, numakir, mock naval battles, and public executions dressed up as mythological reenactments. Slaves filled every role. They fought, they died, they cleaned the blood. Sometimes they were the blood. Contrary to Hollywood, most gladiators did not die in every match. They were expensive to train and house. Lannisty, the managers of gladiator schools, invested in them the way breeders invest in horses. They were fed better than other slaves. They received medical treatment, physical therapy, massages, but not because they were valued, because they were investments. And when an investment failed to please the crowd, it could be discarded like rotten fruit. Even a seasoned fighter could die because a bored audience wanted spectacle. The average gladiator could expect 5 to 10 fights in his lifetime, fewer if he was unlucky. Some won rudies, the wooden swords symbolizing freedom. But even then, many remained in the arena, addicted to the strange status of being admired for dying well. But beneath the stylized violence were others less known, less trained, less fortunate. These were the Noxi, the condemned. They weren't fighters. They were criminals, rebels, runaway slaves, political prisoners, or people Rome simply didn't want anymore. They were not given weapons. Sometimes they were dressed as mythological villains, a cyclops to be slain by a costumed Hercules. Sometimes they were sent out naked against trained men. Sometimes they were thrown to animals, tied to stakes, and left screaming while leopards or bears tore them apart. In one account during the Emperor Titus's inauguration games, over 5,000 animals were killed. Lions, elephants, ostriches, giraffes, but also people. No one kept an exact number. Human blood was cheaper than elephant blood. Among the Nooxi were many slaves. Runaways were especially hated. Under Roman law, a fugitive slave could be branded with thong and forced to wear an iron collar with an inscription. I have run away. Catch me and return me to my master. If caught again, they could be sentenced to the arena. Not to fight, just to die. The crowd cheered, not out of malice, though there was plenty of that, but out of habit. Rome taught its people that blood was a civic ritual, that violence, properly framed, was virtue, that order required sacrifice, and the enslaved were the most convenient sacrifices of all. We know the names of some gladiators preserved on grave markers, scratched into walls, carved into bone. Flammer, who fought 34 times. Crescens, the Gaul, killed by a lion. Ursus, who died in his third match but was called noble. But for every named fighter, there were 100 forgotten men who screamed and were buried without ceremony or fed to beasts whose names mattered more than theirs. Rome called this justice. Rome called this entertainment. Rome called this piety. What it was a machine, not just of death but of spectacle, designed to teach the public who held power. The emperor could give mercy with a thumb. The crowd could call for death with a chant. But the men in the sand, most of them slaves, had no say. Their freedom, their pain, their lives were props. Even in death they were useful, and that perhaps is the most Roman thing of all. There is a particular cruelty in being born to a world that has already decided what you are, not based on your name. You won't have one for a while, and not based on what you do because you haven't done anything yet, just based on who your mother is. That in Roman law was enough. Partos sequentum, they called it. The offspring follows the womb. It meant that if a slave woman gave birth, the child was a slave by default. No trial, no ceremony, no scroll signed in ink, just a sentence handed down with the first breath. Roman society didn't call this injustice. It called it property management. These children were not uncommon. In fact, they were everywhere in kitchens, gardens, back hallways, in the quarters beneath grand villas and the shared walls of cramped insulae. Many masters encouraged their female slaves to bear children, not out of compassion, but as a form of investment. Children were cheaper than buying new slaves from distant markets. A homeborn slave or a bearer cost nothing but food and time. And unlike foreign captives, Veri grew up speaking Latin, understanding the rhythms of Roman life, absorbing obedience like air. Some of these children never knew a world outside the household. They were raised alongside the master's legitimate children, taught to serve them, play with them, protect them. A few were even nursed by the same wet nurse. In some cases, the boundaries blurred until they didn't, because sooner or later the line between heir and handmaiden reasserted itself. One would go on to learn rhetoric. The other would learn how to button a toga without looking up. In rare instances, affection grew. A master might develop a fondness for a clever young slave, especially if he'd watched him grow up in the household. He might grant the boy small privileges, a better tunic, a chance to carry messages, an hour at the writing tablet. If the child was exceptional, obedient, useful, perhaps skilled in music or letters, the master might even promise manumission later in life. But promises were air. Legally, nothing changed. The child remained property. The affection of a Roman master was never protection. It was a leash disguised as favor. And then there were the darker stories, stories the law refused to acknowledge. And so we only glimpsed them in the margins. Children born not out of partnership but out of coercion. Slaves who bore their masters' children without consent, without recognition, without reprieve. The law said that if a master fathered a child with a slave woman, that child too was a slave. In this way, Roman households often became silent, unspoken genealogies of power and abuse. Families folded inside families, never named, never written down. Some of these children lived their whole lives in bondage. Others were freed, not always as an act of kindness, but strategy. A freed son might serve as a loyal business manager, a buffer against other heirs, or a legacy wrapped in plausible deniability. But even freed, these children never quite stepped outside the shadow of their origin. Roman society could be flexible with blood, but never with birth. A freedman might wear a citizen's toga, but everyone knew how he got it. His freedom was a favor, a tolerated exception. There are tombstones here and there that whisper about these lives. One reads, "To Daphnes, born in the house, faithful and clever, freed at 30, loved like a son." Another more cryptic to the memory of Marcia, who never left the kitchen but sang like a bird. You have to read between the lines. You have to know what wasn't said. Most of the children of slaves were never buried with stones. Their names didn't make it into ledgers or histories. They inherited nothing but silence. Their legacy was their labor, their obedience, their early deaths. And yet they were the ones who held the empire together. They ran the households, wrote the letters, raised the legitimate children of the elite. Some even rose cautiously, invisibly through the ranks of the imperial bureaucracy after being freed. A few left behind poetry, one left behind a joke scribbled on a wall. Born in chains, but still better at Latin than you. It's easy to laugh. It's harder to forget. In the end, Rome called these children born to serve. But that's not what they were. They were born to endure, born to remember, born into the machine, but not always broken by it. And that perhaps is why their stories still hum beneath the stone. Because history tried to erase them. But the walls, the bones, the scratched names in the corner of a slave's cot, they remember. To survive in Rome as a slave was to perform, not just labor, not just tasks, but yourself. Every day was a role. Every interaction a test of tone, posture, expression. Say too much and you were insolent. Say too little and you were dull. Be too quick and you were suspicious. Be too slow and you were lazy. The ideal slave in Roman thought was not simply obedient. He was invisible until needed and agreeable when noticed. A tool with a smile. This wasn't just cultural, it was institutional. Roman literature is full of sketches of the good slave and the bad slave. The good slave was clever but differential, loyal but quiet, useful but forgettable. The bad slave was rebellious, sarcastic, or, worst of all, ambitious. Plus, the famous Roman playwright made a career out of these caricatures. His comedies turned slaves into stock characters, tricksters, cowards, clowns. Audiences laughed, not because the jokes were harmless, but because they were safe. A joke about a slave was a reminder that slaves were not real people. They were roles to be played, masks to be worn. But real slaves had to watch those plays too. Some even performed in them. What must that have felt like, seeing your life turned into farce? Knowing that the crowd only tolerated your presence when you were quiet, useful, or funny. To walk home afterward, still property, still under threat, and realize the only acceptable version of yourself was the one written by a free man. And yet slaves were not blank masks. They had personalities, beliefs, tempers, humor. But to express those traits publicly was dangerous, and so many learned to split themselves. The face shown to the master was not the one shown to friends. The voice used in the atrium was not the one used in the kitchen. This fragmentation wasn't madness. It was strategy. You wore the face that kept you safe. Even names were part of the mask. Most Roman slaves had names given to them by their masters. Often, they were ironic. Felix, happy, Candidus, honest, Fortunata, lucky. Some were mockingly grand. Hercules, Achilles, Caesar. A reminder always that your identity was not your own. It was an accessory to someone else's sense of humor. And yet in private among themselves, slaves used nicknames, secret names, names that weren't written down. That's how you preserved a self, not in scrolls, but in whispers. This dual existence shaped everything. A slave might be cheerful in the dining room and bitter in the bathhouse, gentle with the children and cruel to the cook. It wasn't contradiction. It was compartmentalization. It was survival. Historians often try to ask, did slaves accept their condition? But that question assumes the slave had the luxury of a single unified answer. In truth, they adapted. They dissociated, they made masks, and sometimes they forgot where the mask ended and the face began. And Rome depended on it, because Rome did not want its slaves to be invisible. Not really. It wanted them to be visible in exactly the right way, present when needed, silent when not, entertaining when summoned, efficient when commanded. Rome was not afraid of the body of the slave. It was afraid of the soul. That's why education for slaves was regulated. That's why group gatherings were watched. That's why laughter from the servant quarters could draw punishment, because it meant something unscripted had occurred, something not written by the master. Over time, some slaves forgot what their real voice sounded like. Others remembered too clearly and were broken for it. And a few, a dangerous few, wore the mask so well they fooled everyone, even the master. They earned trust, access, secrets, and when the time was right, they acted. Not always violently, sometimes just by walking away. But most never got that chance. Most lived entire lives behind the mask, born wearing it, buried with it. Their real selves surviving only in faint traces. A carved joke, a fragment of graffiti, a nickname etched into a lamp base, the kind of clues no emperor would ever recognize. It's tempting to think of Roman slavery as a grim appendix to a grander narrative, a footnote to architecture, philosophy, conquest. But that's a comfortable fiction, one Rome itself liked to promote because the truth is much simpler and much harder. The Roman Empire was not just built by slaves, it was built for slavery. Slavery was not a symptom of Roman expansion. It was a reason for it, from the earliest days of the Republic through to the twilight of the Western Empire. The conquest of territory and the capture of human labor was so intimately linked that they became indistinguishable like the twin blades of the same plow. Every Roman war, whether pitched as defense, retaliation, or noble expansion, produced a secondary harvest measured in bodies, Gauls, Iberians, Thracians, Jews, Syrians, Britain, marched in chains, auctioned in markets, distributed to generals, repurposed as tutors, cooks, concubines, quarry workers, gladiators, and agricultural machines, often in the span of a few weeks. This was not an accident of logistics. It was the logic of empire. The Romans had developed a military-industrial complex long before those words existed, one that didn't merely extract resources like grain, gold, and timber, but also incorporated the human beings who had once harvested them into an endless loop of unpaid reproduction. Not reproduction in the biological sense alone, but reproduction of value, of control, of Roman identity itself. The numbers are staggering, even in rough estimate. At its height, Italy's population may have consisted of 30 to 40% slaves, a ratio that would today be considered demographic collapse. And yet in Rome, it was the mark of status and sophistication. The doys of a senator might house dozens of slaves, not out of necessity, though labor was certainly wrung from them, but as a form of display, a living gallery of subjugated labor curated to reflect the owner's power. You did not simply possess wealth, you possessed people to carry, clean, count, and witness that wealth. Slaves were not just a workforce. They were an audience, one that never applauded but always watched, silently reinforcing the fiction of their own expendability. This labor structure permeated every level of Roman society. Large estates, especially in Sicily and southern Italy, became plantations known as latifundia, where hundreds of agricultural slaves worked under conditions that bordered on extermination. Overseers maintained order with violence and owners rarely visited, preferring to let profits speak for themselves. These estates competed with small freehold farmers who increasingly found it impossible to survive, creating a migration of displaced citizens into Rome itself, where they joined the ranks of the idle poor, fed by state-sponsored grain dolls, but lacking work, dignity, or power, and where they also became increasingly dependent on the very same slave economy that had destroyed their livelihood. Hoods. This is one of the central ironies of Rome. The free citizen class, so obsessed with liberty, built its society on a labor model that eroded the economic foundations of freedom itself. Even in commerce and manufacturing, slavery served as both lubricant and barrier iron. Skilled slaves were trained as artisans, scribes, metal workers, and builders. They ran workshops, managed warehouses, handled accounting, and often knew more about the business than their nominal owners. Freedmen, many of them former slaves, ran shipping companies, import-export businesses, construction firms, and even temples, creating a strange dynamic in which the social underclass had a monopoly on practical knowledge, while the elite busied themselves with oratory and land ownership. The result was a two-tier economy, one driven by appearance and inheritance, the other by necessity and memory. It functioned not because it was fair, but because it was familiar. And yet, despite its centrality to every Roman institution, political, military, religious, and economic, slavery remained intellectually invisible. Roman philosophers, even those who questioned many aspects of society, rarely challenged the institution at its core. Seneca, who wrote eloquently about cruelty and the moral hazards of luxury, advised treating slaves with kindness, not because slavery was wrong, but because kindness made slaves more loyal. Cicero spoke of freedom as the highest good, but only for citizens. Even Stoics, who believed that all people shared a divine spark, stopped short of arguing for abolition. They simply urged self-mastery within whatever role the gods had assigned, including the role of master. This moral quietism allowed Rome to build an empire on human bodies without ever feeling the need to explain itself. Laws existed not to protect the enslaved, but to codify their status. Runaway could be branded, mutilated, or killed. A master could kill his slave without legal consequence, though later emperors suggested purely as a matter of decorum that this was unseemly. There were no limits on how many slaves a man could own, no age restrictions, no recognition of slave families as legal units. Even when manumission occurred, it was framed not as restitution or justice, but as benevolence, the generous whim of the same hand that had once chained you. By the end of the 2nd century CE, this system had become so entrenched, so normalized, that any attempt to imagine Roman society without slavery would have sounded like fantasy. And yet cracks were forming. The economy dependent on conquest began to falter when the frontiers hardened. Fewer wars meant fewer slaves. The cost of labor rose. The dependence on mass servitude became slowly an albatross. By the late Empire, there were laws encouraging landowners to convert slaves into tenant farmers. Colony, tying them to the land, not with chains, but with contracts. It was not abolition. It was transformation. The Roman slave system did not die. It simply melted into the next version of control, serfdom. But the legacy endured. Europe would forget many things in the centuries after Rome. Engineering techniques, sanitation, centralized governance. But it remembered how to structure society around inequality. Rome had offered a blueprint, and like all great blueprints, it was copied. Not because it was just, because it worked. And in that cold success, the ghost of Roman slavery still lingers in the Roman imagination. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was often portrayed as a noble and generous gesture, a civic ritual that allowed the master to display his magnanimity and the slave to receive the gift of personhood as if it were a laurel rather than a belated correction. The freed slave, now known as a libertus or liberta, would receive a new legal identity, a new name, often a modified version of the master's own, and on paper, at least the full rights of a Roman citizen, with certain exceptions. He could not hold public office, he could not serve in the legions, and he was expected to maintain a lifelong differential loyalty to the man who had once owned him. This relationship, formalized in the bond of patronus and clans, ensured that freedom was never truly free. It came with obligations, duties, and unspoken expectations that could last longer than the chains that had preceded them. The Roman state recognized the usefulness of manumission not just as a tool of control, but as a method of assimilation. A loyal freedman was a more efficient member of society than a rebellious slave. He could earn money, pay taxes, raise children, and vote, all of which extended Rome's influence without costing it anything. It was common for freedmen to remain in the household where they had been enslaved, often continuing in similar roles, but now with a measure of legal agency and the ability to accumulate wealth. Some were even appointed to manage business affairs or oversee property, particularly in families where the freeborn sons were disinterested or incompetent. In such cases, the irony was sharp but unspoken. The man who had once been considered incapable of self-ownership was now trusted with the affairs of his former owner's estate. Yet this trust never fully translated into social equality. The freedman occupied a strange liminal space in Roman society, celebrated for his transformation, yet never quite allowed to forget where he came from. In public, he could wear the toga virilis, the symbol of adult male citizenship, but everyone knew the name stitched into the record books had once belonged to someone else's inventory. Graffiti and satire often mocked freedmen for their perceived arrogance or their lavish displays of new wealth, suggesting that their prosperity was somehow vulgar, unearned, or comically aspirational. Writers like Horace and Petronius delighted in skewering these figures, depicting them as tasteless social climbers, men with silver cups and no poetry, banquet halls but no breeding. The resentment was real, and it stemmed from the fact that freedmen disrupted the illusion of natural hierarchy. They were proof that the rigid class system of Rome was not based on divine order or inherited virtue, but on ownership and opportunity. And that made people uncomfortable. Some freedmen, despite this resistance, succeeded spectacularly in the imperial period. Especially freedmen were often employed by the emperor himself in bureaucratic and administrative roles that senators considered beneath them. They became secretaries, treasurers, record keepers, positions that carried immense practical influence. Under emperors like Claudius, some imperial freedmen wielded more power than many aristocrats. Men such as Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus managed imperial finances, oversaw the imperial correspondence, and influenced key decisions of state. This caused outrage among the old nobility, who viewed the rise of former slaves as not just a social insult, but a political threat, one that blurred the boundaries between those born to rule and those born to serve. But for every freedman who climbed into the upper echelons of influence, there were thousands who lived quiet, complex, and largely undocumented lives. Artisans, shopkeepers, midwives, barbers, bakers, school teachers, people who blended into the urban fabric of Roman life, carrying with them the memory of enslavement, but moving, however cautiously, through a freer world. Some married, some raised children who would be born free and never know bondage. Some founded businesses, built tombs, joined guilds, and worshipped in temples as full members of the civic body. But even in freedom, they bore marks of their past. Their names, always triple, always a modified echo of their master's name, revealed their origins. Their legal records reminded others of their former status. Their children, though freeborn, sometimes struggled with the lingering social stain of their parents' enslavement. In horary inscriptions, one can often sense both pride and defensiveness. Some freedmen emphasized their loyalty to their patrons as if to prove they had earned their freedom, not through resentment, but through proper submission. Others celebrated their professions, their children, or their modest successes in commerce. A few expressed a quieter, more poignant hope that their names carved in stone might last longer than the memory of what they had once been. And perhaps that is the most human part of this entire system. The desire not just to live or to be free, but to be remembered as something more than a footnote to someone else's power. Rome made freedom possible, but never easy. It held out the promise of transformation, then circled it with caveats. It told its freedmen, "You may rise, but you will never forget how you began." And most didn't. Not because they were ungrateful, as Roman elites sometimes accused, but because forgetting would have meant surrendering the only thing they had truly earned. Their sense of self forged not in liberty, but in survival. Slavery in the Roman world did not end with a bang, nor with a proclamation, nor even with a moral awakening. It ended in the same way that a stone column erodes slowly, unevenly, piece by piece until what remains is no longer what it was, but something new that quietly insists it has always been there. The collapse of Roman slavery is not a tale of revolution, nor is it a triumph of conscience. It is instead a study in adaptation. How a society that depended on enslavement restructured its systems not to liberate people, but to maintain control in more efficient, more sustainable, and less visibly brutal forms. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, the Roman Empire had entered a long period of contraction, both in territory and in economic capacity. The wars of conquest that had once flooded the Italian heartland with enslaved laborers. Each new campaign pipeline of bodies into fields, kitchens, and amphitheaters had largely ceased. The frontiers were no longer elastic. They had hardened into walls and garrisons, and military campaigns were increasingly defensive rather than expansionist. With fewer provinces to pillage and fewer enemies to enslave, the supply chain of human property began to falter. This did not provoke a reevaluation of slavery's morality. It provoked a labor shortage. To solve that shortage, Roman landowners, especially those in the Western Empire, began experimenting with new forms of dependency. Instead of purchasing and maintaining large numbers of slaves, they started to bind laborers to the land through contracts and customary obligations. These workers, known as colony, were technically free, but they were often unable to leave the estate without permission, owed fixed rents in cash or kind, and passed their obligations down to their children. The colonist was not a slave in the legal sense. He could not be bought or sold outright, but he could not easily escape his economic position either. Over time, these semi-free peasants replaced many of the functions once performed by slaves, especially in agriculture. What was once owned became rented, and what was once absolute control became contractual stagnation. This shift was not legislated overnight. It emerged gradually, shaped by necessity, crisis, and experimentation. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, in attempting to stabilize the empire's economy and tax base, inadvertently formalized these new labor relationships. Laws were passed tying peasants to the soil, forbidding them to change occupations without permission, and requiring landowners to ensure the productivity of their workers. Rules that, in effect, began to fossilize the social structure of late antiquity into something that would look uncannily familiar in the feudal world to come. It is important to understand that this transformation did not represent a moral improvement. Slavery was not abolished, nor even seriously questioned. It remained legal throughout the empire's lifespan and persisted in household contexts long after it had declined in the fields. Wealthy families in Constantinople and Ravenna still kept enslaved nurses, cooks, secretaries, and musicians. Slave markets still functioned in parts of North Africa, the Levant, and the Eastern Mediterranean. What had changed was not the idea of ownership, but its convenience. Slavery was no longer the dominant engine of production. It had been replaced not by freedom but by stability, an illusion of autonomy maintained through legal language and generational debt. Even Christianity, which rose to dominance during the final centuries of the empire, did not provide the ethical rupture one might expect. Early Christian texts accepted slavery as part of the social order, urging kindness from masters and patience from slaves, but never challenging the system itself. St. Paul's letters instruct enslaved believers to obey their masters. And although some later church fathers encouraged manumission as a charitable act, none argued that slavery was incompatible with Christian doctrine. In fact, as the church accumulated property and wealth, It became a slave-holding institution itself, inheriting the very structures it claimed to transcend. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a centralized state, but a patchwork of successor kingdoms, Visigothic, Ostrogothic, Frankish, each of which absorbed Roman institutions and customs, including to varying degrees slavery. But even in these new regimes, the pattern continued. As urban centers decayed and cash economies contracted, the value of owning mobile slaves declined, and the logic of hereditary land-bound labor rose in its place. Over time, the legal distinction between slave and serf became harder to maintain, not because the world had grown more just, but because it had become more pragmatic. And so Roman slavery ended not with freedom, but with transformation. It dissolved not under the weight of resistance or reform, but under the pressure of economic change, demographic instability, and imperial decay. The chains were not broken. They were simply reforged into customs and contracts, into debts and duties that carried the same weight but bore different names. The human beings who had once been bought and sold did not vanish, nor were they redeemed. They were inherited, absorbed, and renamed by a new world that claimed to be Christian, civilized, and just, but remained in essence Roman. This is perhaps the final truth of Roman slavery, that its legacy did not end with Rome. It continued in silence, in structure, in expectation. The vocabulary changed, the costumes changed, but the essential dynamic, the ability of one group to decide the fate of another by birth, by need, by force, remained. Slavery, as practiced in ancient Rome, did not survive the empire's collapse in a continuous recognizable form. There was no unbroken chain of institutions stretching from the doas of a Roman senator to a 19th century plantation. But the conceptual framework that underpinned it, the deep cultural logic that defines certain lives as labor and others as leisure, has proven far more durable than the physical institutions that enforced it. And perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than in the quiet places where memory hides best. In language, in law, in the everyday structures of thought that feel so natural they escape scrutiny. The Latin word for slave service survives today in dozens of languages, often unnoticed. It's there in serf, which came to define a medieval peasant legally bound to land and lord. It's buried in servant, a word that still carries the scent of subordination long after its explicit legal chains were broken. It lingers in service, which describes everything from military duty to hospitality labor to computer architecture, a term that has become so neutral that we forget its etymological roots in coercion. Even conserve, to preserve or guard, comes from conserving, to keep someone in one's power or possession. Language remembers what history tries to forget. In Roman legal thought, which profoundly influenced European jurisprudence, slavery was codified not as an aberration, but as a normal category of personhood. The Institutes of Justinian, the great Byzantine legal codex compiled in the 6th century and used as the foundation of civil law in much of Europe, defined a slave not as an incomplete human, but as a thing res, a piece of property with a voice, an agent of his master's will, but never his own. This concept of the slave as a tool with memory, a vessel for another's power, persisted not just in law, but in economic theory, moral philosophy, and even early Christian theology, which often borrowed the metaphor of servitude to describe obedience to God, inadvertently sanctifying the vocabulary of bondage. The influence of Roman slavery can also be traced in the way Western societies have historically justified social inequality through narratives of function, hierarchy, and merit. The Roman elite believed that their slaves were suited for labor, not simply because they were conquered or purchased, but because they belonged to a natural order in which some people were born to rule and others to obey. Aristotle's earlier philosophy had already proposed the idea of natural slaves, and Rome translated this into civic practice, codifying the notion that labor without choice was acceptable, even necessary for the functioning of the state. Although this justification was largely stripped of its overt biological determinism in later centuries, the residue of this thinking remains embedded in the belief that some jobs, some lives, some voices are inherently subordinate, that inequality is not only practical, but inevitable. Modern wage labor is not slavery. The differences in legal status, bodily autonomy, and violence are vast and meaningful. But the Roman model of organizing a society by extracting maximum labor from a voiceless underclass has left deep structural imprints on how work is valued and divided. The very idea that essential labor, caregiving, cleaning, cooking, farming, should be performed quietly, cheaply, and without recognition mirrors the structure of the Roman household, where enslaved people did everything necessary to sustain life, while the free citizens devoted themselves to politics, leisure, or philosophy. Today, those forms of labor are still disproportionately underpaid, unprotected, and undervalued, often performed by the descendants of once colonized peoples or by immigrants stripped of status in ways eerily reminiscent of Rome's hierarchies of blood, birthplace, and privilege. Even the architecture of wealth carries echoes of Roman servitude. The modern estate, the luxury hotel, the corporate office tower, all maintain clear spatial divisions between those who are served and those who serve, between the front stage and the back stage, the client and the custodian. These divisions are often invisible to those who benefit from them, just as Roman elites were rarely aware of the full breadth of the labor that sustained their comfort. But the logic is the same: to isolate labor from visibility, to preserve dignity for the few by hiding the toil of the many. Educational systems, too, carry traces of Roman thinking. The liberal arts, originally defined as the studies suited for a free man. Artes liberales were contrasted with the artes serviles, the mechanical or manual arts appropriate for slaves. While modern universities have long since dropped this explicit dichotomy, the cultural divide between thinking work and doing work still persists, shaping how society allocates respect, resources, and opportunity. To be a thinker is to be elevated. To be a laborer, especially in the domestic or bodily realms, is to be necessary but invisible. Rome would recognize this arrangement instantly. The legacy of Roman slavery also survives in our cultural memory of what slavery should look like, often shaping which forms of exploitation we recognize and which we overlook. The Roman slave was a non-person in-law, deprived of family rights, bodily autonomy, and any legal recourse. Because of this extremity, modern people sometimes struggle to see forms of coercion that do not replicate Roman models in full. When laborers are bound by debt, when migrants are forced into work under threat of deportation, when domestic workers live under surveillance without recourse, we hesitate to call these things slavery because they do not match the image burned into our imagination by centuries of Roman precedent and its retelling. In this way, the brutality of Roman slavery can make modern exploitation seem by comparison tolerable. And finally, there is the cultural romance of Rome itself. The statues, the triumphs, the philosophers, the marble legacy which too often presents the empire as a cradle of civilization, while glossing over the reality that it was also one of the most complex enduring systems of slavery in human history. To study Rome without studying its slaves is to admire a mansion without asking who built it, cleaned it, or kept the fires burning, while the guests debated law and love. The intellectual tradition that celebrates Cicero and Virgil must also reckon with the silent, unrecorded millions who made their words possible, not as metaphors or footnotes, but as central figures in the true structure of the empire. Rome is gone, but the scaffolding it left behind in law, in language, in labor, in hierarchy remains. The ghost of its servitude walks not in chains, but in expectations of who deserves comfort, who deserves credit, who deserves to speak, and who must remain always just out of frame. That brings us to the end of our story for tonight. Thank you for listening.